I've just learned why Bernie Ecclestone is loosed on the false news. He's portrayed as funding the flight of Ronnie Biggs, the great train robbery, all of the diversions involving Wraysbury, which was flooded like the Somerset levels earlier this year, and Ronnie Biggs died earlier this year. Up to now, we've been led to believe that what is happening there is that Ecclestone funds all of those scandals and the cover-ups and the gagging of prominent politicians, and the same story was told when we get onto the ownership of the EU and Tony Blair being gifted that for life when Gordon Brown was engaged in a massive fraud in dumping the gold price, selling off Britain's gold at a token price so that the euro could be launched and could become profitable. Blair was gifted the EU presidency for life on the basis of that coercion, and the way that they overcame that risk was that the Conservatives were portrayed as funding him with a massive bung, and he tried to return the cheques, but they refused to take the money back, and Blair was opted out of the presidency and instead has just had to content himself with his role as envoy to the Middle East, and with personal wealth in the umpteen billions and verging on the trillions, because of his desertion of his nation and his ruthless capacity to take that nation to war against the country's will. What I've learned in the last few minutes explains the making of films like The Day of the Jackal, the making of films about Grand Prix, and you've heard about the prominence of Grand Prix, the role of the people like the Cliffords who run the Formula One sector for decades, even although it is the meetings are convened and the racetracks are in the elite locations across the globe where the citizens are treated like shit but the elites are allowed to party, and I want you to know that all of the names that come up in those Formula One movies that we watched in the 1960s are involved in massive political scandals. So the person who was involved in the Grand Prix film called Sarti is actually one of the drug laundering cartels and killers that were engaged in the Villa Andria in northern Africa in the Foccart regime when France was at war with America to predominantly control the narcotic streams across the globe. The reason America went to the Golden Triangle was so it could take control of the production units there, and what we see all through the 1960s and 1970s is Hollywood movies about attempts to assassinate the French president when the most decent president on the globe had been assassinated in America because of his attempts and his belief in the absolute truth that democracy should be allowed to fund itself through democratic means and using elected officers rather than private moneylenders, which is what the globe now entirely has to be content with. And what I just learned on the stock market register, I'm going to go down now and sit down, but I'll give you, so I can prepare a little bit, I'm going to play you the theme tune I could choose the day of the jackal about the attempts to assassinate President DeGaulle, who was a quisling in wartime, but his boss effectively was a backroom man called Foccart, who was a brutal killer, and the name Sarti and the use of that in these Formula One movies leads to the diversionary propaganda that they release. The assassin in The Day of the Jackal kills the beautiful blonde. All of the stories are about deceit in the bedroom, in the Formula One racetrack, and in the families involved there. And when you get to the nub of it, you find that the basis for the Bernie Ecclestone stories is the registration of companies in Ecclestone Square in London, where we have registered the Trident project, the nuclear project that takes in the Scottish referendum. Trident is hosted in Scotland, but Trident is detested by the Scottish politicians, who, like Ecclestone, are just actors. They're paid to play a role in a political campaign which they do not dare win, because the world is run by fascist tyrants. You're getting the gist of it now. I'm going to show you in the next few minutes what the fascist tyrants do, what their director numbers are, where they are registered in Ecclestone Square in London, and how they are run by a man called Timothy Spicer, who's come up in several of our recent discussions. And Tim Spicer, is a mercenary army leader who's had token convictions, but he is now running along with prominent people. Well, they're not so prominent, they're not nearly as famous as Alex Salmond, but they are in a position to create human extinction. They have access to the nuclear button. Scotland is just a puppet in the political games that are portrayed by Zionist Hollywood as a joke, a vicious joke against the world's people. And I'm going to explain some of that in the video that I will make after this one, when I've prepared myself for it. So I'll just let you hear some of the lovely music from the film Grand Prix, and you know all about the Nazi scandals involving Max Clifford, the Aitkins, the people that were in the Beaverbrook dynasty, who at the end of their careers took residence in Monaco, where we have that elite racetrack, and it's host to Beaverbrook's elite home, which was the venue for Winston Churchill's very, very elite 50th wedding anniversary. Almost all of the evidence for the complicity in those crimes and the profiteering across Europe throughout World War II has been deleted from the public transcript. Unless you're an amateur investigative journalist and you take an interest, the music is really moving. So I'll show you some of the Formula One music, and I will allow myself the time to prepare some documents to show you who's in charge of the Trident project in Great Britain, in inverted commas. Okay? Now, the Sarti programme and the projects there, and the portrayal of the great opium wars that embroiled the production units in Marseille, that involved the Nazis that had escaped to Latin America, and the distribution units that were put together there, heavily armed, ruthlessly led, and those campaigns went right through into the mid-1960s and the late 1960s. Production units all around the Golden Triangle, dismemberment of American troops, of prostitutes, of all of the local citizens in Thailand, in Burma, in China, and in all of the regions around that Golden Triangle. None of the combats there have been justified. The asset stripping of corporate ownership and the corporatization of nationalized industries like the car industry in Southeast Asia through the 1980s, 1990s was absolutely ruthless. There were millions of suicides from people that lost their livelihoods, lost their life savings, and it is a brutal, vicious and greedy tragedy. I'm going to play you some inspirational Grand Prix music that the likes of Jeremy Clarkson and Chipping Norton will use to salve his conscience.
Sixth attempt on the life of President DeGaulle. In desperation, the OAS terrorists hired a professional killer. His code name, the Jackal.
This is a once-in-a-lifetime job. Whoever does it can never work again. How much do you want? $500,000. What? In cash. I'd like to know how you expect us to find $500,000 so quickly.
A desperate plan. Nothing left to chance. Every chilling detail. Timed to the second. How do you stop the Jackal? How do you stop the clock?
Commissioner Berthier, we're in trouble on this one, since not even the OAS know who he is. Action Service can't destroy him. Territorial surveillance can't pick him up at the border because they don't know what he looks like.
An unparalleled manhunt. A determined and relentless killer. Impossible to know. Impossible to stop. Every chilling moment of Henrick Forsyth's sensational film, brilliantly filmed by director Fred Zinnemann.
He's vanished. I don't think we really ever had any idea what kind of man you've been pursuing.
Excuse me. It's just occurred to me that we've got 2 days to catch the Jackal.
Of course, liberation.
That's what he's been waiting for.
Step by step, with fascinating precision, the Jackal moves closer to the moment of kill, to the day of the Jackal.
So that's the Zionist Hollywood version, and you now know to be suspicious of that. I'm going to stop this as episode 1 on the scandal around the cover-up on the ownership of the nuclear project in the UK, which is Trident, and all of the classical tricks that the Formula 1 and elites use to avoid detection as genocidal criminals and massive munitions profiteers. The romantic element of it is lovely, and I still skip a heartbeat or two when I see the female French loyalists who are involved and just get killed under a pillow, or their heroic counterparts behind the wheel dies in a tragic crash. When you learn that Sarti is a drugs launderer in the Great Opium Coup book, which has been censored since 1980, then you begin to see that the whole of world history and Hollywood's portrayal of it is a ruthless crock of shit, and how Nicola Sturgeon has the conscience to stand on a podium and tell lies about everybody's stance on Trident, when the ownership of Trident is through mercenary army leaders that have brutalized sub-Saharan Africa for several decades already under Prince Philip's thrall. Then the truth needs to be outed within the next fortnight, and I hope I can rely on the listeners to do that for me. The government and the free press, in inverted commas, will not touch it. They profit from it relentlessly, and everybody lives in fear and austerity as a result.